Hi, my name is Thais Gibson, and I'm the owner and co creator of the Personal Development School. This is your daily breakthrough video, and today I want to talk about questions to gauge whether or not you are codependent. So, before we dive into everything, I just want to let you know too that um, I am staying at my sister's because she just had a surgery. So, I'm sort of out of normal filming location. So, I apologize for any of the light or any of the background noise if you hear it. But I just really wanted to make sure I was still able to get content out. So, first and foremost, codependency is something that I find to be pervasive. It's something that affects tremendous amounts of people, and sometimes it's even like not justified, but sometimes people think that it's noble to be codependent and self-sacrificing. And I really just want to go through codependency and just break down some sort of common myths and give a bit of background of codependency and a tiny bit about the impact of it. Um, and then dive into some questions you can ask yourself to see where you are on the codependent scale. I do have a course inside the Personal Development School that is helping to transform and reprogram codependency at the subconscious level, and I highly recommend it. I'm like really excited that we're releasing it. So check that out if you're interested. But first, just go through this video and see what you can take from it, and you can always do your own research as well and sort of figure out what's right for you. So first and foremost, codependency is defined by dictionary.com as excessive emotional or psychological reliance on a partner, typically one who requires support. But I really want to define it this way. I want us to look at codependency as a pattern of relationship behaviors that essentially create the subtle form of addiction between two people due to unconscious fears about oneself and about the other. And these fears sort of blur the lines between self identity and personal boundaries, resulting in an unhealthy exchange a lot of the time and imbalances within the relationship dynamic. So, you probably, if you guys watch this channel quite often, you hear me mention Dr. Gabor Mate a lot. I really appreciate his work. And he defines addiction as being manifested in any behavior that a person craves, finds temporary relief or pleasure in, but then suffers negative consequences as a result of, and yet has difficulty giving up. And I like to think about some of these patterns within a romantic relationship. Sometimes somebody craves connection so much and they might find temporary relief or pleasure through that connection. But if that connection is taking place, with unhealthy or toxic patterns within that romantic dynamic, so negative consequences are suffered, and yet they can't seem to change the pattern, or they can't seem to leave the relationship or set a boundary or communicate or speak up or any of those things, then we sort of enter into this addicted type of state where relationships can be toxic and challenging. And so I think it's interesting, just for the sake of this video, to consider codependency as almost a form of addiction. And it's interesting because those of you who are really familiar with attachment styles, we know the love addict and the love avoidant are often, just other names for the anxiously attached individual and the avoidance, the dismissive and fearful avoidance. So codependency happens usually because of the rules that we're taught about how to relate all the way back in childhood. It can also be because of long-term relationships that we are in where somebody is naturally codependent and we sort of play by their rules because we're in love, or we don't see the signs, or we don't know how to operate more effectively. But we can think of a lot of codependency coming out of spaces or relationships in earlier life where boundaries were just not defined and respected. And we have 5 major types of boundaries. We have our feeling boundaries, or our emotional boundaries, where sometimes we have blurred lines there and we don't realize that we are taking on other people's feelings all the time. We don't realize that we're making their emotional feelings our feelings and carrying them with us. And the analogy I like to give for this is, while it is beautiful to empathize and be compassionate to somebody and relate to them and provide support when needed, sometimes we can really blur the lines because we can get into a space where we're taking on somebody's emotions. And it's like, if you imagine that one person is hurt and they have a cut on their hand, right? What does the other person do who sees their friend or loved one or partner hurt with a cut on their hand? Well, it doesn't do any good to cut yourself too and then go try to help them fix the cut just so you can, feel the pain that they're feeling. It doesn't make any sense. It's just two wounded people now trying to solve a problem. And the same thing can happen emotionally. Like when we're really not thinking when we're like really triggered, let's say, or we're really feeling a lot of emotions, our activity in our neocortex tends to decline. And so, our logical thinking parts of our brain that are rational and can think things through and plan for the future and do all these things, we don't have as much brain activity in that area the vast majority of the time that we're triggered. So if we have one triggered person, it doesn't help to have a second triggered person trying to solve a problem, right? We always want somebody to be more in an objective point of view, and that's where we get the actual support that we would want to have from somebody else, where they're not taking things on, they're clear of boundaries, they're not solving problems for us and enabling us um, to not take responsibility for our own lives, but they're offering support in a way that's with boundaries attached to it, which means that it ultimately benefits both parties. Okay. So, that's one of many, many things we could say about that. But we have our feeling, our emotional boundaries. We have our thought boundaries. And this largely revolves around our thoughts, our ideas, our opinions, beliefs, those sorts of things. We have our time boundaries. We have our physical or material boundaries. So, physical and material boundaries can be like your physical things or belongings, your physical space, your money, those sorts of things. And then we have our sexual boundaries. So, that's self-explanatory, right? Your body and anything related to sexuality. So, what's really important is that we have a clear idea as a human being where we end and where somebody else begins. And the way that we need to have this is by actually defining what these boundaries are for ourselves ahead of time. Okay. So we get these rules for relating. Sometimes we're enmeshed in childhood and nobody has clear boundaries. Sometimes our boundaries are disrespected. So we're taught basically to drop them because we get punished if we try to put up boundaries or speak up for ourselves. There's so many different reasons that codependency can ensue. But our job is to start taking our power back in a sense by defining what our boundaries are for ourselves. Okay. And keep in mind too, I won't go into this too much in this video, but we have passive codependency and active codependency. So we can have the person in the role as a codependent who's doing everything for somebody else and taking on so much and trying to fix and solve everybody else's problems and feeling all their feelings and all that sort of stuff. And we can have a passive codependent who is going to be more reserved. Sometimes they're the receivers of the codependency. They're the ones that like to sort of take more and receive that extra help. But also the passive codependents can be people who are still taking on other people's feelings and trying to fix and solve problems, but they're doing this more indirectly. Okay. So I can go into that in another video, like in a little more detail, but I just wanted to give you guys a little bit of context about codependency and how to sort of look at it, because it really creates massive challenges in a dynamic. Number one, because wherever we don't have boundaries, we're just creating breeding grounds for resentment. We're also not expressing our feelings. We're not expressing our needs the vast majority of the time. Sorry if you can hear the train going through in the background. But yeah, we're not expressing our feelings. We're not expressing our needs. We're usually not being our authentic selves. We're not differentiating between sacrifice and compromise. Compromise is always wonderful and has beautiful outcomes. Sacrifice is always challenging, can even lead to health complications if people are chronic self-sacrificers, because, it's a lot of stress on a human being, which produces a lot of cortisol, repeatedly over time, which impacts the immune system. There are so many layers to this that I won't even get into right now, but I would urge everybody watching this to recognize how painful codependency can actually be and how toxic it can truly be to relationships. When we have healthy relating and healthy rules, we tend to emotionally regulate better. We tend to be able to express ourselves more clearly. We tend to trust more. We tend to be open to giving and receiving. So relationships have this symbiotic benefit and both individuals thrive instead of wilt over time. So there are so many things we could go into about that, but I'm just going to stay on track for right now. So some questions you can ask yourself to gauge if you see yourself struggling with codependency. I'm just going to run through a bunch, and I'm not going to go through solutions in this video, just because I know there's already so much information in here, but just check in here and notice what shows up for you. Okay. So do you find yourself saying yes to people when you want to say no? It's an important question. Do you find yourself being frustrated, upset, or very hurt, almost to an extensive amount, when somebody says no to you? And usually, if you do find yourself this way, it's because you say yes to everybody. And so your unconscious expectations are projected onto the world around you. And when somebody says no to you, you can't believe. And often I hear more active codependents, for example, saying things like, I can't believe this person said no to me after everything I do for them. And we hear that sort of spiel. And it's just important to be aware of, right? If you find yourself in that space, it's probably because you are overgiving, under receiving. And then when somebody says no to you, it just magnifies the pain you feel around that, really brings it to the conscious surface. So those were the first two questions. Do you find that you are constantly seeking approval from those around you? And this doesn't have to mean every second of every day, but is this a theme throughout the course of your day? Okay, check in and ask yourself that. Do you either lose yourself in relationships, or do you find yourself being afraid of being swallowed whole by relationships? And so as a result of that fear, you try to push people away and really take space. Usually that side of it is the more passive codependent. And usually if you just find yourself longing for relationships, diving in and kind of losing yourself or sense of identity, you tend to be the more active codependent. Do you often pretend to other people you're okay or you're not hurt when you are in fact hurt? Do you find yourself being very upset or bothered if somebody else is upset with you? Do you find that you have difficulty sort of moving on with your day or being able to have a healthy conversation? Do you put a tremendous amount of pressure on yourself and deeply fear making mistakes? Okay, this is another really important and interesting piece of codependency, is that individuals who struggle with codependency often tend to fear making mistakes. They really believe they're sort of earning their worth in the world, and mistakes feel like they're losing their worth or losing approval or connection. And there's usually a strong emotional link between those different things. I have a bunch more questions here, but I'm just going to go through three more because I know this video is going to be a little bit lengthy. But do you find as well that you are constantly comparing yourself to other people? Okay, or this can manifest as well in sort of a hidden form as being hyper competitive with others. Okay, so maybe, and sometimes we'll see codependents who aren't hyper competitive around things they don't care about. They kind of drop out of the race if they think it's not something important to them. Like, let's say, for example, you're going golfing and you've never golfed before. You're like, oh, I'm not competitive at all. But because you won't even allow yourself to be that way, and you might operate in competitiveness in like polarities where you just withdraw completely, or if it's something that's in your area of expertise, you become hyper competitive. Okay, so just check in and notice that there. Do you feel like you want to feel needed by others, or do you feel like you need to be exceptional in some way to feel like you are worthy of being seen or heard or understood or valued by the people around you? And lastly, for this video, do you often feel resentment with other people towards other people because you are consistently or quite often repressing your needs and your emotional expression? Okay, maybe to people please, maybe to avoid hurting somebody, those sorts of things. So sort of the repression and the inability to speak up because you're more concerned about other people's feelings than your own. So check in with those questions, see what you find. I would love to hear, what you find sort of in the comments below, and any patterns that you notice. And if you want to learn more about this topic, please check out the Personal Development School. We've got a tremendous amount of courses at this point. And we do 2 live webinars every single week. So I do them literally live, and the members come in and ask questions, and there's a beautiful Facebook group and community. And we will be offering some specials just going into Boxing Day, leading up to Christmas and into the new year. So check those out as well. You can visit www.personaldevelopmentschool.com. And I look forward to seeing you in the next video.